Alright, so this presentation is on the water cycle. Before that, a couple of quiz questions regarding weather. I think what I'll do is give you a second to read over it, and then I'm going to include the answer in here as well. Alright, so the place with the lowest air pressure would be Bx. So that's the center of our low, and X is oriented closest to that, looking at the isobar, so X would have the lowest. Which of the following is generally associated with a high pressure system? All right, recall that generally speaking, D, fair weather, is associated with a high. Station X, what can we say about the wind? All right, so we would say the wind is out of the northwest or from the northwest at about 25 miles per hour. You can see that because there's 2 full ticks at the end and a half, so we're calling that 25. So B would be our correct answer. The air around a low pressure system is, remember there's 3 motions we want to know. Again, you can use your hand. Remember the lab that we did. If you do 2 of these things, the third comes naturally. So we know that it's inward and clockwise. If I do that, my palm comes up off the table, and that gives me upward. So B, inward, upward, counterclockwise. All right, so generally looking at a few oceanography things, going to start with the water cycle. I know the water cycle is probably something that you may have covered in other courses, especially those taking biology. I know that they cover it there. So I'm going to start with this question. It's also in the Gizmo question, a similar kind of questions. This would be basically if you turn on your faucet at home, where does the water come from? So depending on where you live, and you can think about whatever home you want, where you grew up or where you live now. So I'll have you answer that in the Gizmo, but my experience on this is a lot of people just don't really have a great idea of where water comes from. Same way that maybe they don't have a good idea of where electricity comes from when they plug something into an outlet at home. So it's a good way to get people thinking about where exactly does water come from and where does it go when we're done with it. All right, so one thing that I like to use to illustrate this sort of use of water and the process of the water cycle is to think about this artificial environment where we've had to do the same thing, the International Space Station, right? So water's really heavy. We can't take water up to the International Space Station. We can't bring used water back. So there's got to be this reprocessing of water. And this diagram kind of shows that. And so same thing is happening in the larger communities that we live in. There's a finite amount of water. We use it, we clean it, we reuse it. And so there's this waste management system to recover liquids and dispose of the solids. But we reuse it, right? And so there's a finite amount of water on the planet. That same amount of water has been on the planet for a long, long time, back even when the dinosaurs were roaming the planet. They were drinking the same water that we're drinking now. It's gone through different forms. It's changed over time. But there's a natural sort of cleansing process that happens on our planet. We also have these artificial cleansing processes that we've included, wastewater treatment plants. So that's all done on a smaller scale here at the International Space Station. All right, so again, as I said, there's a finite amount of water available. So let's just take a look at these pie charts. So fresh water means that water that does not have salt. So for the large part, potable water that we can drink. All right, so if you've been to the ocean and got a mouthful of water, you know that we can't drink that. We can desalinate it. It's just that there's not really a great efficient process for taking salt out of water on a large scale. So that's generally not done. It can be done, but we really don't do that to get fresh water. So looking at the amount of water on our planet, only 2.5% of the water on our planet available to us is fresh water. Of that, going to the smaller pie chart, a lot of that is locked up in ice caps and glaciers, and we would like to keep it that way, right? And so it's hard to get ice back into those ice caps after it melts. So we try to keep it there. 0.63% of that 2.5% is groundwater, and so we do tap into that. And then we have some in the atmosphere and some in lakes, rivers, reservoirs, and things of that nature. All right, so normally in class we would do the water cycle, which is very similar to the other cycle that we did in class where we roll the dice, go through the rock cycle. So can do that, can't do this. In its place, you guessed it, we're going to do the water cycle gizmo. It basically does the same kind of process as the rock cycle. So these two are very similar. I do want you to know some of the parts of the water cycle. Again, depending on what diagrams you look at, there are different terms used to describe some of that. But the basic gist of it is fine. All right, so just like with the rock cycle, it is a flow chart of sort of what can happen, how water can move through different phases and end up in different reservoirs. So here's just the picture that I grabbed off the interwebs from the United States Geologic Survey. You'll see that sometimes these words are breaking apart. For example, sometimes you just see evaporation and transpiration. Here they're combined, evapotranspiration. That's not really that important to me. It's the overall process that's important, and realizing that this overall process cleans water, right? And so as water is evaporated from the ocean, that salt is left behind, and it precipitates fresh water into streams, and the fresh water gets cleaned as it enters into the ground, right? And so if you live in a place, going back to our earlier question, that has a well, that process of water moving through the ground, moving through those minerals in the ground, and the amount of time that it takes to do that cleans the water so that as we tap into it with a well, we get largely potable water. We may have to add some things to it and clean it from time to time, but overall it's pretty clean, right? And these fresh springs, for the most part, we can get away with drinking water out of that, although just to be safe, we'd probably want to purify it anyhow. All right, so here's the amount of time that water spends in these various reservoirs. You can see that glaciers tend to, what is that, 100,000 years. Others, a lot less. In the biosphere, 1 week, or in the atmosphere, 10 days. Groundwater, you can see that varies, and we'll look at that in a future lesson. The rate that water moves through the ground can be calculated as a formula for calculating that based on what's happening in the ground in terms of the composition of the ground. Be remiss not to mention the human impacts on the water cycle, and most of that comes from building impervious surfaces, right? And so we've built these impervious surfaces, blacktop concrete buildings, that all lead to runoff. That runoff leads to flash flooding, and so we'll be talking about flooding today and a little bit next time, next week. But the flooding has become exacerbated. It's become worse due to the amount of impervious surfaces. So we're not really letting the groundwater infiltrate, not letting that water infiltrate into the ground. Instead, it runs off rather quickly as surface water and can overwhelm a system, as we've seen the last, I guess, 5, 6, 7 years in Ellicott City, right? All that building and some other factors have led to some flooding that is above what we would expect in terms of flooding there. All right, a quick look at oceans. So questions are, or is, how many oceans are there? So you could be counting them up in your head. Meant to be a bit of a trick question here, because we really got to think of the ocean as one large ocean. Yeah, there are different sections that are named that help us identify the regions that we talk about, but the water's not blocked the way that the continents are in some cases separated from other continents. So we have these sort of regional names that we can use to talk about the different areas, but water can move and flow around, and that's important. All right, so you already know that most of the Earth is covered by water. So that 71%, or approximately 71%, is a good number to commit to memory. We already said that the ocean contains most of the planet's water, so that's a good thing to know. This is just, that's not something I would want you to commit to memory, but just so you know, there are all these dissolved gases that are in water as well. somewhat important. All right, sometimes people ask where the salt in salt water came from, so I thought I'd just throw a couple slides in that talk about that. So that's what these do. I'll let you read through those at your leisure. Salt still enters into the ocean via a couple of different mechanisms, but it also leaves and is left behind. Excuse me, the average ocean salinity is about 3.5%. So that salinity is important for us for a few different reasons. One, again, that's not potable water. It's not water that we can drink, but it also increases the density of water, and that's important because it leads to the movement of water in the ocean. So we'll be looking at that. All right, so one of the things that we can do in a class is to explore this with these density wells that we have. Obviously, we don't have those that are availability right now, but I did get a video from a student who was in class last semester, and she sent me this video. So you can see these two wells that we have. We put food coloring in, and I can't remember, and the student can't remember exactly what the conditions were, but some of the variables that students can play around with is different temperature water. So you can heat some water up, you can use some cold ice water, you can add salt to water, you can not add salt to water. So there's a couple of different variations that you can use, and you can add the food coloring. So I'll just play this and you can see what happens. So here we have two different densities of water. And in this case, the more dense green water moves to the bottom, sinks to the bottom, and the less dense blue water stays at the surface. And they start to mix up a little bit, but for the most part, they level out over time. And we let these sit for a good bit of time, and they stayed separated out. Even those with different temperatures stayed as separated layers for a fairly long time. Oh, it's not what I wanted. There we go. Okay, so seawater varies in density because of the salinity and because of the temperature. Right. And this causes, just like we saw in the little wells, this causes the movement of water around our planet. You can see that that varies at the surface level. As we move into the equator where it's warmer, we get a higher salinity and warmer water, and then a higher salinity over here in colder water. So this causes water to sink or to rise in different areas and causes the water to move around in what we would call density currents. And so water generally tends to sink at the poles because it's more dense, really for two reasons. It's cold, and as water freezes to form the glacial ice, the salt is left behind, and so it's colder and more dense because of the salt, and that sets up some density currents. Okay. So you have this deep water moving down that is cold and dense. All right, I'll let you click on watch on that little conveyor belt. I think I have a static picture somewhere in here. All right, so overall we get this this movement of water, these cold, deep, salty currents rising and then forming these warm, shallow currents as they move around the planet. Okay, so these are ocean density currents, not the same as wind currents. All right. So those of you that have studied weather have seen this picture before, these Hadley cells. We have the equator where it's warmer, colder at the poles. That causes this general movement of air. Right? But as the Earth spins, it sets up these trade winds, right? But also these westerly winds. And so we see these general patterns, and it's these general patterns that are come out of the Hadley cell that I would like you to know this general trend, shown probably better here. Again, the wind out of the west for westerly, and the northeast trade winds means that the wind is coming from the northeast. Right? So these set up some general patterns. You can see it's sort of the opposite, north and south pole. And these lead to the ocean drift currents that are usually aptly named. And so these are what I would like you to focus on because these have an effect on the climate in the area of making it more mild or balancing the temperatures here. So I'll give you a moment to study this. We'll